Welcome. Today we are going to address the philosophies of Friedrich Nietzsche and C.S. Lewis in relation to one another, and really one of the more common themes that exist throughout the majority of their works, and that is dealing with morality. Do morals exist outside of your own assumptions of them, or do they not? And so these two are a great test case and kind of let you see the strengths and weaknesses of both arguments. We begin our discussion today with a question that is probably something you've thought about before in your life. Are there absolutes concerning morality? Or is morality just kind of what one group of people say is what's right, or what an individual says is right? Or is it all just kind of smoke and mirrors and we get to do what we want to do and we kind of put in obstacles to really make it easier for us or harder for others? Can we say things like theft, rape, and murder are wrong always? Or most of the time? Or never? And what basis do you have if you're going to say that they're wrong even once? Where does that authority come from? Now, some of you have easy answers to this, but really this is the heart of a lot of ethical debates, is where do we say that something is right or wrong? What dictates that something actually is right or wrong? Why is it okay or not? Friedrich Nietzsche, in his work Beyond Good and Evil, says, no, there are no absolutes concerning morality. Nothing is essentially right or wrong. Yes, some things are not popular. Some things aren't going to get you invited to any of these parties, but there's not any sort of absolute morality that's going to dictate anything other than maybe ideas that you should do what you want for you. Nietzsche lived 1844 to 1900, a German philosopher, atheist existentialist. We will see that his notion of existentialism differs quite a bit from other existentialists, be them theistic like Kierkegaard or atheistic like Sartre. But again, he's definitely an atheist existentialist. This is an appropriate title for him. His major works include The Birth of a Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, A Genealogy of Morals, Thus Spake Zarathustra, and The Will to Power. Throughout all of these works, there's kind of this theme that your choices still do matter. Right? He still is an existentialist, that it's about your choices and decisions, but he weighs this idea of your choices and decisions against different concerns, where morality comes from, or who dictates what's good and evil and what choices you should make, or the role religion would have in this idea of God saying what's going to be okay or not, and the difficulty that exists with you choosing what you're going to do. Nietzsche says, as a group, as soon as philosophers have busied themselves with morality, they have demanded from themselves, with a formal seriousness, which makes one laugh, something very much higher, more ambitious, more solemn. They have been looking for a rational basis of morality, and every philosopher, so far as he believed that he has provided such a rational grounding for morality. But morality itself has been considered something given. This is the key idea for what he's addressing, the idea that morality is seen as something given, delivered, coming from some other source, some other authority. And all this science of morality, up to this point, what is still lacking, odd as it may sound, is the problem of morality itself. What has been missing is the suspicion that there may be something problematic. Nietzsche points out that everyone talks about where morals come from, be it Kant or anybody else. Maybe from God, maybe from society, maybe something, but it's always the idea that it's something given. But people haven't pointed out that it might be problematic that it wasn't delivered to us at all. Nietzsche continues that there are moralities which are intended to do things. Morals are a tool that are used to get a certain result, to justify the creators before other people. Other moralities, it says, are meant to calm him down and make him satisfied with himself. With others, he wants to nail himself to the cross and humiliate himself. And with others, to practice revenge. With others, to hide himself. With others, to be transfigured and set himself above, high up and far away. This morality serves its originator so that he forgets. That morality so that he or something about him is forgotten. Some moralists may want to exercise their power and creative mood on humanity, some on others. Yet that morals are always used for a purpose, that it's a tool as opposed to something which actually exists on its own, according to Nietzsche. And this is why it's problematic. This is why it needs to be looked at and addressed. Perhaps even Kant, he says, wants us to understand with his morality, what is respectable about me is that I can obey. And things should be no different for you than they are for me. Right? That this is how he sees even Kant in the notion of the categorical imperative. Deontology is a whole class of ethics, is about look at how good I am, that I can obey, and please you do the same thing. You be like me. This is how Nietzsche sees it. In short, moralities, he says, are only sign languages of feelings. They're not having a basis in anything other than your own particular fickle mood. Every morality, he says, therefore, is in part a tyranny against nature, and also, therefore, against reason. Right? This is the problem with morality, is that it is a tyranny, that it's all about control, that it's against what would just be reasonable. Nietzsche, in many ways, is connecting way back to earlier skeptics and cynics and others, and asking questions like, what do we see about nature? What is humanity by its nature? The cynics had one answer and the skeptics another, and Nietzsche yet still another. But closer to the skeptics, that it's at the best indeterminable. Beyond just being indeterminable, Nietzsche says nature reveals herself as she is, in her total, extravagant, and indifferent magnificence, which is an outrage, but something noble. Nature doesn't care about you. Therefore, this shouldn't be the basis of morality. And this is not a new thing, this idea that morality is something given, but rather it goes back, at least to the time of Plato. He says Plato, who is more innocent in such things and without the mischievousness of a common man, wanted to use his power, the greatest power which a philosopher up till that time had had at his command, to prove that reason and instinct inherently move to a single goal, to the good and to God, things that are used as proofs for the existence of God by people like Aquinas and others. But of course, how does Nietzsche see Plato and Aquinas and Aristotle and Socrates as all morons, as all people who are inventing something and going against reason? That since Plato, all theologians and philosophers have been on this same road. That is, in things concerning morality up until now, instinct, or as the Christians call it, faith, or as I call it, the herd, has now triumphed. We may grant Descartes an exception. At least he's got a little bit of a, hey, not everyone is quite as bad. And we might want to give some people a little more exceptions. And Nietzsche grants this to Descartes. He says he's the father of rationalism and thus the grandfather of the revolution. This revolution of thought that he is now a part of, right? Trying to dictate and ground things in reason as opposed to somewhere else. A man who conferred sole authority on reason. But reason is a tool, and Descartes was superficial. And so reason, he says, itself is great, but it's also only a tool to help dictate and understand how we're going to move. And Descartes didn't go far enough. That his appeal to reason didn't include all aspects of morality. It was only a superficial treatment, according to Nietzsche. That there still is this problem of something being given. So what do we need? We need a call to action. He says, all these moralities that direct themselves at the individual person for the sake of his happiness, going back to Epicurean and other discussions, right? This idea of wanting to be happy, that these people have all followed the same basic path. It says, what are their exception proposals about conduct in relation to the degree of danger in which the individual person lives with himself? Recipes against his passions, his good and his bad inclinations, to those extent that they may have a will to power and to want to play the master. Right? That this is really what we see with most of these discussions about morality. Is it's about keeping you safe. It's about navigating your passions instead of just asserting yourself. It says, to the extent that they may have a will to power and want to play the master. But still, this isn't what we're going to see from most people. That most are this weaker man. That his most basic demand is that the war, which constitutes him, should finally end. The goal for most systems of morals is finding this balancing act amongst the passions. And what does Nietzsche say? Forget that. That's only for the weaker people. What you want is a will to power, to go beyond this. Happiness, which is usually kind of the goal by arresting your passions, he says, seems in accordance with a calming medicine, a way of thinking, for example, the Epicurean or the Christian, this weaker sort of man. Principally the happiness of resting, of having no interruptions, of smugness, of the final unity, of the Sabbath of Sabbaths, to use the words of the saintly rhetorician Augustine, who was himself such a man. Right? He kind of throws people under the bus, as we see obviously here with Nietzsche. Right? That every discussion, every treatment on how to overcome the morals, he says, the passions is just to try to make you feel happy, but that itself is not reasonable. Right? And that all of these salt themselves, he says, they're over-seasoned with talks about the other world. Everything is generalized to a point where it's not healthy, according to Nietzsche. Then arise, he says, those delightfully amazing and unimaginable men, whose enigmatic men predestined for victory and temptation. Notice here they're not overcoming the passions. They're not sitting with this rest, this having no interruptions. They're facing their temptations. They're succumbing to their temptations. They're eager to do so. It says that these most beautiful expressions are Alcibiades and Caesar, and maybe among artists, perhaps Leonardo da Vinci. And most notably in his mind, of course, while writing this, Nietzsche is thinking about Napoleon, so that they appear precisely in the same ages when that weaker type, with its demand for quiet, steps into the foreground. Both types, he says, belong to one another and arise from the same causes. When those weak men hold power, those, like Caesar and Napoleon, seize that power. They take it. They don't just let it be that others are in charge, others who can't hold that power. No, these Übermensch, they take it. For example, he says, a compassionate action in the best of the Roman period. Compassion was neither called good nor evil, nor moral nor immoral, according to Nietzsche. And even if it was praised, this praise brought with it, at best, a kind of reluctant disdain. as soon as it was compared with any other action which served the demands of the totality of the rest of the republic. The people. This is maybe what it was, but again, it says these ideas of compassion during the Roman period didn't really exist. Now, I would disagree with Nietzsche as far as some of his historical statements. I think there would be some claims that we would look at one way or another, but this is his idea, to look back and even say, when did we see this? We saw a handful of individuals just taking what they wanted, that this served everybody because they rose up, because they were in charge, and everyone else was weak and falling. So where does our morality come from, according to Nietzsche? It's always something given, right? But he says ultimately, the idea of the love of one's neighbor is always something of a minor importance, partly conventional, arbitrary, and apparent in relation to the fear of one's neighbor. After the structure of society in its entirety is established and appears secure against external dangers, it is this fear of one's neighbor which creates once again new perspectives of moral value judgments. That here, once again, the mother of morality is fear. Now, notice the evolution of thought here for Nietzsche. First of all, we need to be secure against foreign threats. Once we're not afraid of somebody coming in from the outside and attacking us, our fear still exists. But now, instead of being a stranger, the barbarians at the gate, or something along these lines, what we have to be concerned about is our neighbors. Your neighbor is now the one you're afraid of. So how is it that you keep your neighbors from just taking your stuff? Well, it's not going to be the same as how you would keep the barbarians or the next village or whatever it was, depending on the history that we're going to be talking about, right? How is it we keep ourselves secure within a society? Well, we now have morals. You don't take my stuff. Why? It's not okay. It's not moral. And why do I say I want you to take my stuff, hit me over the head, break my head, and take all of my belongings, my children, my whatever? Well, it's out of fear. And the only way that you and I can work and relate with each other is through the lens of fear, the guise of fear. It's not love of our neighbor that's making us do things. It's mutual fear. I'm afraid that my neighbor can kill me and take my stuff. He's afraid that I'll do the same. So we have moral codes that we create to try to lessen that fear, to lower the angst, to now allow for my neighbor and I to shake hands, showing that we are not holding weapons and about to, kill each other. That this is what happens, that this is the evolution of thought. It's not love, but fear that drives morality. The high independent spirituality, the will to stand alone, even powerful reasonings are experienced as a danger, though. And everyone who wants to do their own thing, those people who, hey, I'm going to do it on my own. They're a danger. We can't allow for that. We must all be in this together. We must have the protection of the herd. Everything which lifts the individual up over the herd and creates fear of one's neighbor from now on is called evil. That's what's going to happen. Is it's now evil that you're saying this or believing that. The proper, modest, conforming faith in equality and the average of the desires take on a name of morality and honor. That this is the idea. As long as you're staying here with the herd, you're perfectly fine. We like you. You're moral. If you're going to stand up against that, if you're going to be butting heads with somebody else, no, you're out. No good. Because now you're a cause of fear. Nietzsche says very clearly, I am morality itself. Right? Morality today in Europe is the morality of the herd animal. I am morality itself, and nothing outside of me is moral. I am the one who decides what's moral. If I want to do something and I think I can get away with it, it is now moral. Not what the herd says, not what's written down in law codes or scriptures, but what I have, if indeed I have the will to power to overcome this. Otherwise, I'm lost just along the lines of everyone else. Then the herd dictates what's moral, but that's not the case. I am morality. I dictate it. I am the one in charge. Nietzsche argues that there is not morality itself. There are only various instincts and teachings put upon individuals. So, does this work? Can we accept that there are no standards for morality whatsoever? Should we simply do whatever we can get away with? Is it okay if your neighbor robs you while you're gone, knowing they can get away with it? Or is that wrong? Is it okay for you to cheat on your significant other just because you can get away with it? Or is that wrong? Is it okay to go kill some random stranger for the thrill of it because it's thrilling if you think you can get away with it? Is the morality only what is going to be the larger consequence to me and what's likely going to come about? Should you expect your neighbors to also follow this standard of doing whatever you want? And why not? Is Nietzsche right? The only reason why you don't want your neighbor to do it is out of fear of them. Or is there some other basis on why things like theft, rape, and murder are immoral? Or are we left with Nietzsche saying, no, get away with it, do it. Most of you can't, because most of you are the herd animals. Most of you are weak, but there's a few of you who will do it anyways, and those are the ones that I'm addressing. For many of you, you push back on Nietzsche's idea that there is no basis of morality, but still like the idea of being relative. You don't want to say that everything counts as okay, because you're going to say, well, we as a culture have decided at least that things like robbery and murder and rape are not okay. So even if you can get away with it, it's not okay. So you hold the relativist position of Nietzsche, but you expand it. Instead of just being about the individual and what you think you can get away with, it's what society says is okay. It's what a broader culture dictates this, and this is the argument of cultural relativism. This was best articulated by William Graham Sumner, who wrote in 1906, and he put the argument this way. The right, quote, right, way is the way which the ancestors used and which has been handed down. Right? That there's this tradition. It's things that worked for that culture. Right? The tradition is its own warrant. Right? The tradition itself is what holds this value. It is not held subject to a verification by experience. The notion of right is in the folkways. It is not outside of them, of independent origin, and brought to test them. In the folkways, whatever is right. This is because they are traditional, and therefore contain in themselves the authority of the ancestral ghosts. When we come to the folkways, we are at the end of our analysis. What our culture has given us. Therefore, cultural relativism, what our ancestors, the folkways, that tells us what's moral. We don't have additional questions that need to be brought in because we've understood it in this way. Sumner, in this discussion, allows for a very clear and easy answer of what's right and wrong. what is it the culture says is right and wrong? Not what do you want, but as a culture, what have we said is acceptable? Now, some of you might disagree with some of the cultural norms, and you're wrong, according to Sumner. Sorry, this is what the cultures dictate is right and wrong. This is what's dictated morality. And so whatever is the case now is what morality is now. This idea doesn't only exist with Sumner, but we also see earlier examples oftentimes being used to advocate for things like cultural relativism. Potentially, the first historian of the world, a man by the name of Herodotus, recorded this down as well. There he gives various stories of different people groups, and one of which he kind of marvels at and kind of in jest. In book 3, he says, ends up painting up this picture, this sort of discussion about the differences between the Greeks and the Indians, the people of India who had different customs than the Greeks. And Herodotus is kind of having fun with this in jest. Herodotus points out that if one were to offer men to choose out of all of the customs in the world, such as seemed best to them, they would examine the whole number and end by preferring their own. So convinced are they that their own usages far surpass that of all others. Darius, the king of Persia, after he had gotten the kingdom, called into his presence certain Greeks who were at hand and asked, "What should I pay them to eat the bodies of their fathers when they died?" To which they answered that there would be no such a sum of money that would tempt them to do such a thing. It was seen as morally repugnant in their eyes. He then sent for certain Indians of the race called Calations, men who eat their fathers when they die, and asked them, while the Greeks stood by, what he should give them to burn the bodies of their fathers at their decease. The Indians exclaimed aloud and bade him to forbear such language. And it's a little quip back and forth, and it's a little, hey, look, what do you prefer? You prefer your own cultures. You prefer your own norms. Your morality of what's seen as okay comes from this. Right? The Greeks would think that it's immoral to eat their bodies, while the Calations would have thought it would be immoral not to. And what is seen as acceptable by one group is seen as reprehensible by another. In fact, even with the fervency of devotion and love. And so this is oftentimes used within the broader discussion of cultural relativism. The ethicist James Rachels points out that there are certain consequences of accepting cultural relativism. While we might have things like Herodotus's stories being true, that doesn't mean necessarily that cultural relativism is correct. In reference to William Graham Sumner, he says that there is no measure of right and wrong other than one's society. The notion of right, he says, is in the folkways. It's not outside of them, of independent origin and brought to test them. It's in the folkways that whatever is right. But what happens if we take that seriously? What would be the consequences of actually being cultural relativists? And Rachel's really kind of pushes this issue, right? If we don't want to accept that there are no bases of morality, and our answer is then to say that the basis is found in the culture, in the folkways, then what are those consequences? One, he says that we could no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own. This, of course, is what a lot of people see as one of the strengths of cultural relativism, but then what do we do with societies that differ? What do we say about societies that say it's okay to beat your wife because that's okay in that culture? Is it okay to beat your wife once you cross an arbitrary line? Does the morality change because you're on different ground? Or is it wrong always to beat your spouse, regardless of what the culture that you're a part of says, or the ground that you're standing on? It says this implication of cultural relativism, he says, is disturbing because few of us think that our own society's moral code is perfect. Do you think our society is perfectly morally? Probably not. Probably you've got a few points of contention where you're going to say this or that or the other is off, that it needs to be more tolerant of this or less tolerant of that, and that you don't think that how things stand right now with the cultural norms and practices are what things should be like. In fact, we can think of all sorts of ways in which our own society can be improved. Yet cultural relativism actually forbids us from criticizing the codes of not only other societies, but also our own. What our society has said is true is true. What our society says is moral is moral. Therefore, you cannot challenge it. You cannot appeal to another standard. Now, tomorrow it might change and you have to change with it. But it's not up to you to challenge it. In fact, the idea of moral progress, Rachel points out, is also called into doubt. Right? That it was wrong for MLK to call for the Montgomery bus boycott and to oppose segregation because society at that point said it was okay to have separate but equal. In fact, we even had this in the laws of Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Also, things like Dred Scott is seen as wrong. By the way, the Dred Scott case is usually, amongst constitutional scholars, Scott for Stanford, etc., though is considered the worst decision ever rendered by the Supreme Court. Anyone who takes a look back and goes, right, that this is like the worst thing. Those of you unfamiliar with a little bit of the history of Dred Scott, right, he petitioned the court for his freedom based on a Missouri law in 1847. This eventually made its way to the Supreme Court in 1856. The legal discussion that Dred Scott had is that he resided in a free state and then moved to Missouri, which had a law on the books that said once you were made free, you couldn't be made a slave again. So why is it now I'm being treated as a slave? In effect, it said that all blacks were not full citizens and could not ever sue for justice. This is a horrible thing. And yet, right, this was deemed the law of the land. This was seen by legal scholars at the time as what is right and consistent with our law codes and the morality of the people. So, do we say that these should have just stayed that way? Of course not. We call into debate the effects of Dred Scott. We applaud MLK for the brave stand of the Montgomery boycott. And we would say that those people who upheld the morality of the day were just simply wrong. That they were upholding immorality, not being moral. But if we accept cultural relativism, we have to say that no, indeed, there should have been no advance. There should have been no change until the folkways change. Until the next generation decides, yeah, by the way, back then, yeah, it should have been different. Oh, well, but how do you push for change? How do you call for change? You can't under cultural relativism. So, are there absolutes? Does this mean that we're left with an idea that there are indeed some absolutes concerning morality? If ethical relativism and cultural relativism both have problems, which they clearly do. You might not agree with the strength of those problems, or you might think every system is going to have its problems and this is just the best that we've got. But if you do think there are problems, then do we need a different basis other than our own particular moral discomfort with something for arguing for moral absolutes actually existing? This is the task that C.S. Lewis undertook. C.S. Lewis, Clive Staples Lewis, lived 1898 to 1963, English novelist and lay theologian, in all likelihood the most notable and popular theologian of the 20th century. He was known as an apologetic to the intellectuals. He taught at Oxford and Cambridge. He's the author of popular novels as well as theological addresses. His more notable writings include Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, and a book for children, or a series of them, The Chronicles of Narnia. And these are really all used in some degree or another to include arguments for morality. In C.S. Lewis's work, Mere Christianity, he has a section titled Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. He starts with something that's very common and familiar to all of us. He says that everyone has heard people quarreling. We've all seen it. We've all probably even been a part of it, right? Where you're quarreling with somebody, you're arguing with somebody, usually making moral claims in this argument as well. Lewis says what interests him about all of the remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. Rather, he's appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. And the other man very seldom replies, "To hell with your standard." Nearly always, he tries to make out that what he has been doing does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, that there's some sort of special excuse. Nearly always, he tries to make out that what he has been doing doesn't really go against this standard at all. Right? That this is the real point is, no, I'm not doing anything wrong. Everything I'm doing is right. To go back to that nice little car parking scene from the show Seinfeld, right? George is backing the car in while the other man pulls in, and both are arguing that they have equal claim to the parking spot. George says, no, I'm doing it right. I didn't pass it. I was backing in, that this is the standard to which we all agree to. Well, the other person simply replies, that's not how I do it. And there's no law that says you have to go past it. You are too far ahead. You've already vacated this space, right? That there's an assumed amount of space that beyond the actual parking space in question that you've gone past, right? Both of which are appealing to some sort of standard, that they're not breaking the social compact, they're not violating any rules, and that the other person needs to relent. Now in the show, the entire episode goes with them parked halfway into a spot before they have to clear out, and neither ends up getting anything as a result of it, but both of which were appealing to a standard that they were morally right, or that the standard that the other person might expect doesn't always have to apply, or there's an exception to this rule. Now this law or rule about right and wrong to which these people are appealing to says used to be called the law of nature. Nowadays, when we talk about laws of nature, we usually mean things like gravitation or heredity or the laws of chemistry. But Lewis says that when older thinkers called the law of right and wrong the law of nature, they really meant the law of human nature. That there is a law dictating how we respond to each other. The idea was that, just as all bodies are governed by the law of gravitation and organisms by biological laws, so the creature called man also had his law, with this great difference, that a body could not choose whether it obeyed the law of gravitation or not, but a man could choose either to obey the law of human nature or disobey it. Right? That there are laws that dictate our morality that exist like the laws of gravity. But you can choose to go against it. That there's certain biological laws that you can't violate, but then there's certain things that you can do to circumvent those. Right? This is the idea of human nature, that we can go around these standards, but these standards exist outside of us. Lewis says, of course, I know that some people say that the idea of the law of nature or decent behavior known to all men is unsound, because different civilizations at different ages have had quite different moralities. But he says this is simply not true, which is, of course, its own shocking sort of statement to say. He says that there have indeed been differences between their moralities, but these have never amounted to anything like a total difference. If anyone will take the trouble to compare, he says, the moral teachings of, say, the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greeks, and Romans, what will really strike him will be to know how very like they are to one and each other, and to our own. Lewis, by the way, does have a background in the classics here, and is saying this from knowledge and not ignorance. He says that he really needs only ask the reader to think of what a totally different morality would mean. What would you think a completely different morality would look like? Can you think of a country where people are admired from running away in battle? Where a man felt proud of double-crossing all those people who had been kindest to him? You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 make 5. No, indeed, you can think of a handful of people who violate the culture's norms, that violate this law, that flout it because they're psychopaths, sociopaths. They think that the laws of everyone around them don't apply to them. But they're the exceptions, not the rules. Just like when you do something wrong, you know that it's an exception to the behavior and the code of what you think you should be upholding, and not the rule of how you want to dictate your life. At least this is the claim made by Lewis. He says that men have differed as regards to what people you ought to be unselfish to, whether it was only to your own family or your fellow countrymen or to everyone. But they have always agreed that you ought not put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. Men have differed as to whether you should have 1 wife or 4, but they have always agreed that you must not simply have any woman that you'd like. There's never this thought of it's perfectly okay to do these actions that we as a society say no, or there's an appeal to one moral claim and standard over another. It's unfortunate that we have to do this. It's not because we admire it or think that it's great, but we as a society say that this is what we have to do because otherwise we would have perished and wiped off the face of the earth. That might be why we have to abandon some children or do something else, or that there's some other standard that supersedes these, and we rank them. And some societies might rank them slightly differently, but that doesn't mean that they're abandoning these ideas entirely. Nietzsche and others obviously object, saying, isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct? And hasn't it been developed just like all of our other instincts? Is not the real problem that of morality itself? Lewis retorts, supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you'll probably feel 2 desires. One is a desire to give help due to your herd instinct, indeed. The other is a desire to keep out of danger, due to the instinct for self-preservation. You're going to have multiple instincts, multiple impulses, multiple drives. But what tells you what you ought to do and what you ought not to do? He says that you will find inside yourself, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and to suppress the impulse to run away. This is the law of nature, or morality. Lewis also pushes back against the idea that some of our impulses are good and some are bad by nature. He says it is a mistake to think that some of our impulses, say mother love or patriotism, are good and others like sex or fighting instinct are bad. All we mean is that the occasions on which the fighting instinct or the sexual desire need to be restrained are rather more frequent than those for restraining motherly love or patriotism. But there are situations in which it is the duty of a married man to encourage sexual impulse and the soldier to encourage the fighting instinct. There are also occasions on which a mother's love for her own children or a man's love for his own country have to be suppressed, or they will lead to unfairness towards other people's children or countries. Strictly speaking, he says that there are no such things as good and bad impulses. That we'll find ourselves pushes and pulls and our own drives of morality one way or the other, but again, there's some sort of code that's going to dictate when things are okay and not. And we can look towards Aristotle or Plato or anyone else for helping to define when and where this is. But that this exists is the point for Lewis. Others will claim that morality just is defining what's inconvenient for us. He says, for instance, we might try to make out that when you say a man ought not to act as he does, that you only mean to say that the same as when you say that a stone is the wrong shape, merely that it is inconvenient for you. But of course, this is simply not true. A man who occupies the corner seat in the train because he got there first and a man who slipped into it while my bag is turned and removed my bag are both equally inconvenient. But I blame the second man and do not blame the first. I am not angry, except perhaps for a moment when I come to my senses, with a man who trips me up by accident. But I am angry with a man who tries to trip me up even if he does not succeed. Yet the first has hurt me and the second has not. Indeed, there are times that things are inconvenient for us and we wouldn't say it's immoral at all. Sometimes it's moral, or even the right thing, and what's inconvenient for us is really what we're called to do. Sometimes the behavior which I call bad is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite. In war, each side may find a traitor on the other side to be very useful, but though they use him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. You cannot say that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful to us. Morality and utility are not one and the same, contrary to what either Nietzsche or utilitarians would advocate. So, what is this moral perfection to which we are addressing? Moral perfection is not a matter of taste, even if it is itself unattainable. It is an ideal instituted by the law of nature, by the law of human nature. It's not an ideal, quote, right, in the same way as other ideals, since we all share the same standard and not different tastes. Perfection is the goal, even if it is unattainable. Every moral failure causes trouble to others or yourself, just as like the failures in math result in you getting the wrong sum. Lewis points out that we can err in a handful of ways. One, we can make errors, mistakes with others, right? We go wrong by drifting apart from each other or colliding into one another. And we also make errors within our own selves. We interfere with ourselves and we cause ourselves our own set of problems. Right? These passions that we had talked about before come back and we need to navigate them well. Lewis likens this basic sort of relations that we see and this call for perfection as a fleet of ships. Each one must be seaworthy. It can't have its own mistakes in itself. And it has to not collide with one another. That one is also necessary for the other. If it's not seaworthy, for instance, the steering is wrong, it'll start to crash into the others or fail to even set sail with the rest of them. If it interferes with other ships, then it's going to risk breaking itself and making them or themselves sink. The ship of morality also has this destination. It has a moral implication and it has a direction to which we are all being called to go to. Now, what this is and where this is up for debate and discussion, but since the work is a right and a wrong for a clue to the meaning of the universe, that we can clearly see for Lewis that moral perfection is at least heading towards the idea of the order of the universe and ideas that need to be wrapped up within that. So at the end of this debate, we're left with the simple question: are there absolutes concerning morality? And if so, where do they come from? If not, what basis do we have in asserting one thing to be morally correct or not? Is morality really nothing left than saying what's convenient for me or what I'm expecting? Or is there a larger standard that we're all kind of assuming is true?